My name is Ryan Bartlett. I live here in Denver. I've been a resident of Colorado for over 20 years and originally from New Mexico. So Rocky Mountain region's my home. I run the organization Colorado Native Bee. My purpose with the organization is we're outreach. I educate at state parks and classrooms and stuff like that. Peapan's one of my favorite places to present at because I love the people and I love the purpose. Let's go ahead and begin. First of all, please feel free to follow us on Facebook and Instagram, and then we have a Facebook group called Rocky Mountain Native Bees. There are quite a few experts on there, some doctorates, and great taxonomists that can help you ID the bee in your photo. Just submit your photo with perhaps where it was found in the region, Rocky Mountain region, and we'll help you ID it. So great resource to have, the Rocky Mountain Native Bees group. These are my two children. This is Amelia and Abigail. This is a mural over at the History Colorado Center. It's actually a curved mural, so they're standing on it. It's pretty cool. All right, let's venture into bees. So just cutting to the chase, Colorado's unique in that we have almost 1,000 species of bees here in Colorado. So the official recorded number is 946. That was recorded, the official recording back in 2011. We have a few more that have shown up since then. Just the official list hasn't been updated as of yet. So 5th place, I think that's pretty great for Colorado. And so Colorado having almost 1,000 species, North America has almost 4,000 species of bees. And then of that, we have 20 to 30,000 species of bees worldwide. That is actually possibly a low number. 20,000 is definitely a low number. 30,000 is definitely a little more like it, mostly because if a bee hasn't been named with a scientific name, it's not generally counted. So there are plenty of bees that still need to be ID'd down to species level, and then we've got our official list. So before we begin, this is absolutely one of my favorite quotes by Clay Bolt. Clay Bolt, if you're listening, thank you for all your work. We humans defend the things that we value, but how can we care about something we barely know? So if you don't know that we have all these bees that are here in Colorado, those almost 1,000 species of bees, how can we care for them? How can we build a program to educate people and to keep their habitats and their floral supplies happy? So my purpose really rings with this quote: gotta educate. Education to me is key. And so part of Clay Bolt's process was he produced a 20-minute film called Searching for the Rusty Patch Bumblebee. I'm sorry, Ghost in the Making, Searching for the Rusty Patch Bumblebee. It's on YouTube, highly worth the 20 minutes of the video. And it's about the first bee that was placed on the endangered species list. I highly recommend it. So a little bit first about plants and trees. There are about 12% of the plants in the world that are wind pollinated. So your insect pollinated plants, oops, pardon me, let's go back. Your insect pollinated plants and your wind pollinated plants, pollinated by wind, would be like the oaks and the ash and ginkgos. But our insect pollinated plants are definitely like the almonds. A lot of our crops depend on pollinators, especially willows here in Colorado. So back in 2016, one of the first bees for the US was placed on the endangered species list. That's actually 7 species of the genus Hylaeus, the yellow-faced bees. And you can see in this picture why it's called yellow-faced bees. They're also called masked bees. They've got this little yellow mask that varies from species to species, but that was the first one that was placed on the endangered species list for the US. And then shortly after that, 2017, we had the rusty patch bumblebee, which is what Clay Bolt's video Ghost in the Making is about. So 2017, and we've got others that are possible for the next ones to be placed on that. So this is actually happening in China. This is a Chinese farmer that is hand pollinating his pear tree. He has probably overused pesticides for years and killed off all of his natives, and then farmers or beekeepers, just like we have here in the States, where you get beekeepers that take their hives from farm to farm to help pollinate those crops. Those beekeepers won't go anywhere near his property because they are afraid to lose their bees because of his overuse of pesticides. And so he's left with nothing other than to hand pollinate his crop. And I tell you what, it's a lot of work. So we've got places like MIT, Walmart's actually in the game, trying to produce a alternative to bees, robot bees. And I have to tell you that I think it's kind of an awful idea. We've already tried it with this guy. This is Bumblebee for those of you that may be familiar with the Transformers. So real quick, let's just jump back in time to find out where bees come from. What is their lineage? So these are some bees that were found in amber or fossilized, and it really comes back to when the first flowering plants evolved. So 141 million years ago, we had the first flowering plants evolve, and with that we had wasps that would visit those flowers and now find a carbohydrate source, the nectar, and a protein, the pollen. And those wasps all of a sudden became vegetarians. So they no longer needed to go after other insects. They didn't have to be carnivores because there was this reliable source on this flower that nobody else was taking advantage of. So those first bees evolved from those wasps 140, actually probably closer to 130 million years ago, probably about 10 million years after the evolution of flowering plants. And with that, we had this explosion in diversity at the KT extinction back in about 59 million years ago. So with that extinction, you had this explosion of both plants, flowering plants, and then the bees that pollinated them. And they exploded into a whole bunch of different bees, different colors, different types, different sizes. We've got blue bees, green bees, black and yellow, black and white, yellow bees. And so that mostly took place about 50 million years ago. And they co-evolved with plants. This is a picture of pollen grains under an electron microscope. And these are different grains, like the yellow ones, the yellow spiky ones, I believe are like sunflower. And we've got smaller ones that may be from willow or some other plants. And they co-evolved this Velcro method. The bees produced these hairs, fine hairs on their legs and on their bodies that acted like Velcro on certain pollen grains. And absolutely just fascinating. If I didn't study bees, I'd study pollen strictly. So you can see pollen, the sunflower pollen here is 30 micrometers big, and allium. And so there are sizes of pollen grains. They go all the way from 15 to, we've got some that could reach close to 20 in size, so, or 200. And here's a couple other of my favorites. Columbine, as you can see, is pretty small, and then they get a little bit bigger. And here's honeysuckle at close to 75. Absolutely just fascinating to study pollen in itself. And with that, we had bees that specialized in certain processes. We have a process called buzz pollination. That's a process known mostly with bumblebees. Bumblebees will actually vibrate. They'll grab onto a flower and vibrate. They'll unhinge their wing muscles and vibrate at this frequency that makes the pollen explode out their anthers. So if you have a moment, Google buzz pollinations. There's some great videos that are on there about that topic. So we've got bees that only pollinate certain plants. This particular bee is able to pollinate a tomato flower. Honeybees can't do it. They don't know how to pollinate a tomato, so you'll never find a tomato being pollinated by honeybees. And so some of the traits that we have on bees for the most part tend to have a lot of hair. And I will tell you that there's a lot of gray. There's a lot of gray in bees. Either they don't always fit the mold. Wasps generally have little hair or no hair, but again, there's that gray area in there. So don't totally rely on that. And bees, for the most part, forage for pollen and nectar from flowers. You'll find a lot of wasps at flowers. They're generally only there for the nectar, the carbohydrate. But for food for their young, that protein for their young is typically from another insect, meat of some kind of protein. So again, a little comparison. We've got yellow jackets, paper wasps, honeybees, flies. They can all typically look the same, especially when they're on a flower. And we'll get into some of those differences here in a minute. So again, understanding what is not a bee is kind of the first step. You know, here we've got European paper wasp. They're the ones that you're finding that are typically under the eaves of your building. This one happens to be on a fence, and they've, for some reason, built it facing up. But each one of these little holes has a larva, and they're feeding that larva until it is ready to pupate, which when they cap it, that larval stage is pupating, and then it metamorphoses into an adult and emerges as an adult. So we've got the bald-faced hornet. As you can see, here's that gray area. It has plenty of hair. Definitely could be confused for a bee with all that hair. And to make it worse, they like to do nests up in trees. So I get a lot of calls saying, I've got a beehive up in my tree. No, sorry, that's actually a hornet nest and really don't want it. So anyways, but you can see in the summertime with the leaves on, it's pretty active. They're only one season. In the wintertime, that hive is completely vacant, and then also degrading with the weather. So, but they can be big. They can be pretty big hives, and the wasp itself is pretty big. Here's yellow jackets. Yellow jackets tend to like to be ground dwellers. This one was behind a kind of a retaining wall, and there was a pretty good sized nest in there. There probably was 200, 300 yellow jackets in there. So flies get confused for bees all the time, but flies typically have the short antenna instead of the long antenna like a bee, and their eyes often meet, not always, but often. And they have two wings, but that's pretty unreliable when you're out in the field looking at a flower, unless you actually have the specimen, can pull the wings apart. It's not going to be an ideal way to tell them apart. It's generally that short antenna, and it just takes practice. Here's another one that looks just like a bumblebee. Short antenna, the eyes don't totally meet, but they get pretty close, but you can see pretty stubby antenna on the front end. And we have flower flies that also look like bees. So here's that coloration. Here's a hoverfly that looks pretty convincing as a bee or a wasp. It's got longer antenna than most flies, so it could fool you. The eyes are pretty big, so that definitely is a telltale sign. And then, of course, the bee fly. The bee fly is special in its own way, and that's a whole class in itself. So, and getting back to why things look like bees and wasps, well, a fly can't sting because it doesn't have a stinger, and a wasp or a bee does. So, for example, my kids both know uh, martial arts. I don't. So I try to look like them because everybody else is afraid of my kids. And if everybody thinks I'm like my kids, well, then they'll stay away from me. It's a way to prevent others from attacking you, predators, whatnot, because you look like something that could be dangerous. So mimics are all over throughout all of the animal kingdom, um, just for that protection. It's to fool somebody to thinking that you are not to be messed with. So we have a few more. Up in the upper corner, we have a robber fly. This robber fly actually is kind of like a dragonfly. They hunt. And then we've got narcissus bulb flies. We've got square-headed flies. All of them can have that similar coloration, the striping, something to fool you into thinking that it's pretty dangerous. And to make things worse, here is a moth. Well, this moth doesn't even have any mouth parts other than a proboscis. It can't even sting you nor bite you. It doesn't have any mandibles, but the coloration, absolutely. This is one of our clear-wing borers. The borer, the actual larval stage, lives in some of our poplars like aspen and cottonwood, and then comes out just to mate, and looks pretty convincing to me. So bees, this is a great resource for those that are looking for resources. This is from the Digital Museum of Natural History. I think if you just Google those words, Digital Museum of Natural History, they have great little posters that have, this is about 36 bees, I think, with a little map showing their region that they can be found in the US. So bees, again, exploded into this diversity. We've got big, huge bees like the carpenter bees, the bumblebees, and then we've got tiny little bees. This is little Seratina, which is also a carpenter bee. It's one of the ones we find here in Colorado. Little tiny stem-dwelling bee, you find them in stems of roses and your blackberry or your raspberry bushes. That's where they like to nest, is that tiny little hollow stem. And so for comparison, here's my thumb, pardon the dirty fingernail. That's what happens when you're a gardener. My fingernail's 10 millimeters across. So this little bee right here that I've circled is barely no more than 5 millimeters big. And for comparison, a honeybee would be about 12 millimeters in size. So here's one of the smallest bees. This is the smallest bee in the world so far. Measured 2 millimeters, just sits on the eye of that bigger bee. Absolutely cute little bees. They're called fairy bees. As you can see, they're pretty small and fairy-like compared to their monster brothers and sisters. And so that plays a huge role into the distance that they can travel. So that little perdita, the little fairy bee that was sitting on that eyeball down at the bottom, 100 feet is a long distance for it to travel for floral resources, for pollen and nectar. And so versus the honeybee that can travel on average 9,000, mile and a half, 2 miles, up to 5 miles if they need to find floral resources. So for those little perditas and the hylaeus, the real small bees, it's a lot like the old game Frogger, except with a bee. You've got to cross that road. You get a 4-lane highway, and that's quite the feat. So big highways, in my mind, can divide populations of bees. We've got one side that's got one species of bees, and it's such a wide road. can they make it across the other side to the other bees on the other side? So dividing populations like that may have its long-term effects or not. I'm not quite sure. So bees produced, when they evolved, they discovered ways to carry pollen differently. So our honeybee, which is over here on the right, has this flattened part on its hind leg that it packs sort of a wet pollen with. So they take nectar or saliva and pack that on there to sort of create a hard pack on the leg, versus some of our other bees that carry dry pollen. This bee on the left has these big bristle hairs and it carries a dry pollen. And then we've got some other bees like our mason bees, leafcutter bees, that carry pollen on their abdomen. So they developed different ways to carry that pollen. You can see all that yellow on that underside is all pollen. This is a female leafcutter bee. Here's another one. Really absolutely just great pollinators. We've got pollinators that are specific pollinators that only pollinate one type of flower or a family of flowers. That would be a specialist, versus a generalist bee. Generalist bees like the honeybee really just have this wide range of plants that they will go to for food resources, flora resources. So they're generally the generalists. And we're going to stop there for just a second. Anybody have any questions that they want to ask before we move on?
Ryan, we have a few questions. Let me get to my list.
Okay.
The first one is a question. You mentioned that a certain bee does not pollinate tomatoes. So what species do pollinate tomatoes?
We have a lot of species that can pollinate the tomatoes. That whole family, tomatoes, potatoes, small bees, some of our small serratinas and our hylaeus can get actually into the tomato. Your other bees, like some of our solitary bees and bumblebees particularly, can do that buzz pollination because they can't. The way the flower is, they can't just get in there and tromp all over and pick up the pollen. They have to actually figure out a way to get it out. So buzz pollination actually sends that pollen out. And I should have included that video, but I was afraid it wouldn't play. So look up buzz pollination. That'll answer that question for that. There are lots of species that can. The honeybee is not typically one that does. Does that answer that?
Well,
Any other?
I think so. The next one, are hornets considered wasps?
Yes. The wasp family includes hornets. So I would say it's just a classification. So the bigger classification is the wasp family. And they're just part of that family.
Can mimics, you talked about pollinators or little bees or flies that mimic bees and wasps, can mimics be pollinators too?
Oh, absolutely. I'm a pollinator. I have a lemon plant upstairs that seems to always bloom in the middle of winter, and I take a Q-tip and I go and pollinate each little flower. I'm not an effective pollinator, so a lot of our insects that do visit a flower, absolutely. If you got one grain of pollen that moves from one flower to the next, I would consider it a pollinator. Is it an effective pollinator? No, absolutely not. Bees reign as the best in that category, and so pollinators can be anything: wasps, butterflies, birds, bats. We have tons of different pollinators. It's really more of the effectiveness of that particular pollinator.
Got it. How about fairy bees? You mentioned those. Do we have those in Colorado?
We do. We do. The little perditas, we absolutely do. They look like gnats. They're fast, they're small, and they're hard to find. So, um, getting pictures of them, I've been studying bees for over 10 years, and I have barely a handful of pictures of the perditas just because they're hard to find.
And among our Colorado native bees, do we have both generalists and specialist feeders? And if we have specialists that are native here, what do I need in my garden to feed them?
So one of the specialists, and we'll see a picture of her later, I've got pictures of uh, cactus bees that only pollinate cactus flowers. That is their source. So we have lots of generalists and lots of specialists. We have willow specialists that you'll find out sort of in riparian areas that only feed on willows. Um, in your yard, I would just focus on native plants, for native bees. Can't go wrong. Uh, it's the plants that don't grow here. That's what you're gonna not have your natives to. You need a native plant really for a lot of those natives. You'll get native bees visiting other plants, but um, especially some of our invasive weeds, you look at those and watch them, they're mostly getting honeybees and non-natives attending to them. You won't really find many of our native bees on them. So native bees, native plants for native bees.
And one person asked or mentioned they don't see many bees in their squash blossoms and wondered if there was a reason why.
You know, I haven't been seeing many squash bees in my squash blossoms this year either. I don't know if something, I mean, it's been such a crazy year with the early freeze back in April. Um, Definitely been an interesting year. I don't know if they're all late. I mostly only have male flowers on my squash bee plants at the moment, so maybe it's still just a little early. Last year I saw lots of squash bees. Peponaceous was pretty abundant last year, so
Keep
I
looking.
would say keep looking. It might be a little early.
Okay. And just a couple more. Should you have a bee box in your garden? I am new to Fort Collins and got one at the store.
So we are going to talk about bee boxes here in a little bit. I'll answer that question later.
Okay. And is the use of neem oil detrimental to bee populations?
So neem is a growth inhibitor. So you can use it on um, aphids and such. It basically sterilizes the insect. It's not a true insecticide where it's not a stomach poison. Um, Neem oil in itself is actually best mostly used to coat the insect's body, and they breathe through pores on their body, sides on their body, and you're basically clogging those with the neem oil. So neem oil, I'm not going to get too much into neem oil because I don't use it and I'm not an expert in it. So um,
One
that's
more.
a good question. You can always email me later.
Okay.
Email me back.
Okay. And question. Every morning, this person sees bees that seem to be sleeping on her or his zucchini blossoms. Are they actually sleeping?
Yes, everything sleeps, and we're going to get into that too. All right, should we move on?
Yes, thank you.
Great. All right, so the first big family of bees is the family of bees that contains the honeybees, the bumblebees, and the carpenters and longhorns. And you'll see here in a little bit why they're called longhorns. So the honeybee, not native to North America, it originated from East Africa. They are the ones that produce the beeswax and the honey, and they're considered highly social. They live in those hives of 10,000, 50,000 bees. You're going to find a queen, drones, which are the males, and the workers in there. A lot of our other bees are all solitary. They either live in small communities like a bumblebee or totally alone. So the honeybee producing that producing that wax and that honey. And they're the ones that we here in Colorado, we typically find in those silver maples that are hollow. They like big cavities. Our silver maples are notorious for having big cavities. So if you see bees up in a tree like this, most likely they are honeybees. Here's a picture of it pretty low down. Typically they like to be 20 feet plus up in the air, but this opening was probably 10 feet off the ground. And there's a little cavity in there. And so honeybees were brought to the colonies way back with the settlers in 1622 on a ship, Jamestown. And the Native Americans thought they were kind of crazy. They called them the white man's flies. It's totally something totally different. These are pictures of different types of hives that they used back then in the 16 to 1800s. So baskets and boards kind of made into a little box, and often just using a log that was hollow to keep those in there. And so also they're the ones when you see swarms, that's a honeybee swarm. They're pretty docile. What they've done is they've gorged on the food, on honey in that hive, and the new queen is leaving and she's taking a bunch of them with her. And when you get a swarm just sort of sitting, they're just waiting for the scouts to come back and say, hey, we found a vacancy over in this maple off the corner, Brain and 32nd, a couple miles away. And so the bumblebees, we have 24 species of bumblebees here in Colorado, which is huge. We have 49 species of bumblebees in North America. So we have half of the bumblebees found in North America right here in Colorado. This is Bombus hunti, one of my absolute favorites, Hunt's bumblebee. Here's Bombus nevadaensis, the Nevada bumblebee. She's pretty big. She's a big bee. You can see Bombus hunti right next to nevadaensis. You can definitely see the size difference in this photo. And here's a size difference between a tiny little leaf cutter, Herades, right next to a bumblebee. And the golden bumblebee, Bombus fervidus, she's mostly yellow with a little bit of black on the tail end. And then the brown-belted bumblebee, she's got mostly black on the abdomen with a little brown belt on it, which is kind of hard to see. It's just a slight little brown belt right there through the middle between the yellow and the black. And so there are keys to figure out how to figure out which bumblebee you have. When people are learning their bees, I often say, this is the place to start. So because we only have 24 species of bumblebees, they're pretty distinct. There's a few bees that can look like a bumblebee, but for the most part, people often know a bumblebee when they see one. And so keys help to break apart that anatomy. So we've got the head, the thorax, and then the abdomen's broken into those segments. And it's the segments that really are the telltale. So you'll either have a black head or a yellow head. Some have a little bit of both. And then your tergal segments that range in different colors. This is the Hunt's bumblebee. You can see in this photo here, we've got the two stripes on the back, like this here picture right here. And here's a bumblebee nest, Hunt's bumblebee nest. Let's see if it'll play. There we go. This was a nest that was found in a compost pile. So you've got some, over here you've got pollen. This is the yellow, that pollen in there. There's, my video just quit. So you've got nectar or water in, I was afraid of that. I just lost my whole presentation. Pardon me, just give me a moment. Sabina, you want to see if you got any other questions?
Sure, I'm fielding the questions via the chat. So if you have questions, feel free to type those in. One of the questions that came in recently was when you were talking about swarms, and the question is, isn't it the old queen that leaves the hive with the swarm?
You know, it varies. I do not study honeybees, so I don't really have a great answer for that I confidently can answer with.
We know you're the native bee expert.
Yep, I like my natives.
Do bumblebees all have the ability to sting?
So all female bumblebees have the ability to sting. Males can't sting. Any species any male of any species cannot sting. They do not have the parts to sting with. So a stinger is a modified ovipositor. Basically an egg-laying device.
And if someone was outside and a little insect landed on them, how would they know if it was a fly or a bee?
You know, it just takes practice. So a lot of our bees can be pretty small. The sweat bees typically like to come to people and take their sweat for the salt. It's not totally known why they like to do that. Let me find where we were. I apologize.
And then someone wanted to know, is there a list of native plants that are paired with native bees?
I'm working on that list. It's taking me years to do that. There's not much of a list, but eventually some of us will figure that one out. I have a list, but it's incomplete.
So we are recording this video, and we might need to edit this part down a little bit, but
Yeah. Okay. I'm back up.
Today. Okay, great. For those who weren't able to join today, I think we did max out. Brian has offered to do another presentation of this same topic. Great, looks great.
Okay, so back to charts. Here's the Bombus griseocolus, the brown belted. You see that okay, Sabina?
Yes, I see it.
Great, okay. All right, so we're gonna move on a little bit. So again, 24 bees, bumblebees, that's just for bumblebees on this chart right here, here in Colorado. So getting to some of the longhorns, you can see why they call it longhorns. So this is a one of the Mesoloides, male longhorn, absolutely just gorgeous antenna. Can't mistake longhorns. And we've got anthrophoras. I love anthrophora because the name itself means flower bearer. And they're digger bees. They live in the soil. And here's a two-spotted longhorn. This is a female. She was actually on corn, which surprisingly enough, corn is typically wind pollinated, but these bees will pollinate corn occasionally. They're often found on corn. And here's a little closer picture. This one's on hibiscus flower. So our two-spotted longhorns, they've got two little spots on the back. Black bee, if you see a little tiny black bee, not tiny, because that might be a Seratina, one of our carpenter bees, but she's a little bit smaller than the honeybee, about 3/4 the size of a honeybee. And so meanwhile, while she's collecting pollen, here are the males. The males are all snoozing away. I think there was a question about bees sleeping in flowers. That would typically be a male. Males like to chase girls in the day and fight over territory with other males, and then come sundown, they all kind of gather together and drink mead and hang out and aggregate. So you'll find aggregations of bees in particular areas. Those are all males just hanging out till the next day when they can chase girls again. And some of the best places to chase a female bee would be to sleep in a flower. She's coming in the morning. So great place for finding a mate. So here's some of our carpenter bees, little tiny carpenter bees. They like to make their nests in dead wood stems, piths of plants, like I mentioned earlier, your roses and your blackberries, raspberries, that type of stuff. And this family also has some interesting kleptoparasitics. So kleptoparasitic in itself means to steal, klepto, to steal. So they typically are stealing resources from other bees by laying eggs in a nest. Here's another one, the nomada species. So she will run in, lay her eggs in the nest of another bee that she's parasitic on, and her egg will hatch rather quickly, and that larva will consume and possibly kill the other larva of the host species. And they're interesting in themselves. So lots of interesting kleptoparasitics in this family. And so we also have the next family that we're going to talk about is the sweat bee family. The sweat bee family contains a lot of bees that are small. They're the ones that come to your skin to perhaps get that salt. So Halictus rubicundus, the orange-legged sweat bee. Here's a picture of a sweat bee next to a honeybee, so you can see that size difference between the two of them. And here's a picture of a sweat bee next to a honeybee again. A lot of people are like, oh, what a cute little baby bee. No, that's actually an adult bee. That's a full-grown adult sweat bee. And so the sweat bees are absolutely gorgeous. They're some of the most photogenic bees around. They've got that metallic green, sometimes striping. They're really, really pretty. And they're some of our early bees. We see them early in the spring in April when the only thing around are dandelions. And they've got these great mandibles. So they also are ground dwellers. So you can see her mandibles in this picture here. And they like to live in the ground. So in this picture on the right, it looks like a little anthill, and when in fact, indeed, there is a little chamber down there. And so she's creating, here on this picture on the left, there's a little resting chamber right here from the entrance where she may rest for the night. But each one of these contains a little cell or a little egg, and you may actually have multiple females in the same nesting site. So you could think of it more as an apartment complex. You've got building A or apartment A, B, C, D, and E versus this one over here on the right that has mostly only one female attending to it. And so here's that sweat bee. She's emerging from that nest just maybe to go get more pollen and nectar for her young, pollen for the protein source. And it looks like that little anthill. I'm going to skip this video because I'm afraid it's going to crash my computer. So the Megachile family, the leafcutter family, we have 630, over 630 species here in Colorado. I'm sorry, North America. They are the ones that are typically living in those bee boxes, the native bee boxes, the little reeds. Here's a resin bee. And one of our non-natives, the European wool carder, Anthidium. So Anthidium, you can see why it would be confused with wasp. It's got that broken coloration on the back, and definitely fast little bee that may look like a wasp, when in fact it's a bee. So Anthidiums, all mason bees, leaf cutters, they typically have this large head. Here's a male, and you can see the head almost looks bigger than the body. This is a great picture showing that. And males aren't there to collect pollen, they're there to find a mate. You can see it has collected a little bit of pollen on its body. That would be unintentional, unlike the female, which is actually there collecting the pollen to provision for the young. The males are only there for mating. And you can again see big head. Here's that, oops, pardon. So this is one of our mason bees. I found this in Boulder. And so because of the way that they collect pollen, they can be often as efficient as up to 100 honeybees. One mason bee can pollinate the same amount as 100 honeybees. And the males, this is a male, you often find this little tuft hairs on the front of their forelegs. That is a telltale sign that you've got a male for some species. So here's the orange-tipped wood borer bee that is specific to a lot of our flowers for cactus. This is an opuntia flower. Two of the females in here collecting pollen. And you can see a little piece on their front end. They almost have this little horn on their forehead. Here's a good picture of that little horn right there that you can see. So definitely gorgeous little bee. And this family is also has its kleptoparasitics. So sharp-tailed bees, you can see why it's called sharp-tailed bee. It's not actually a stinger, just is got that tail that looks like it. We're running out of time, so I'm going to move on to the last part, and then we'll answer questions. So reason that leaf cutters are called leaf cutters is they create these little nests. So you've got these perfect circles cut out of the leaf. That's just cosmetic damage. They're just collecting a little material to tuck their babies in with. No pesticides needed. That's generally, to me, indicates that you have a healthy ecosystem. So completely tolerable effects on the plant. And here she is. They've got two different species cutting that leaf material. And you find it on ash. This is not leaf cutter, so you can see that the damage is not uniform. It's not oval or round. It's kind of scattered and no uniform look to it at all. So something totally different. So we see it on serviceberry, on black locust, on lilac. You'll often see it on lilac. And there she is. She's got it tucked between her legs, going down in, and this is an old log, like an old elm log, and she's found a little spot in there to create a nest. So it's important to have old logs on your property for some of these natives. They'll use anything like that that either has old borer activity in it or cracked logs like this one. I'm going to skip this video as well. So in there, we've got these little cells. So each one of these cells down here on the bottom has an egg with pollen bread. That's basically the pollen and the nectar. And that little larva is going to feed off of that until it's ready to pupate, come out next spring. And there are more families to talk about, but we're running out of time for this presentation. Here's a Hylaeus, one of the families we didn't talk about. We did talk about this bee in the beginning because of the bees that were placed on the endangered species list back in 2016. So lots to learn about bees, more than we can cover in just this hour. So where do bees live? They're typically in the soil. Of our 950 species, 70% of those live in the soil. So we've got 700 bees that are soil dwelling. Like this one's diving down into its nest. You'll find bumblebees that will create nests out in fields or in compost piles somewhere where they can stay protected or warm. And then the sweat bees, you saw this picture earlier. So a lot of the place to look for bees is in the soil. And then those males, here's some of the longhorn bees. This is the time of year, July. Go out to your sunflowers in the evening and you'll find the males will be snoozing away. They'll grab it with their mandible, like part of the flower with the mandible, and then just sleep away the night, be ready for the morning. Here's a male leafcutter that was just sort of hanging out on the underside of a fresh bud on a sunflower. So we've also got resin bees. These are little tiny, this is like the leaf cutter, except instead of using leaf cutter material, it's resin from trees and little stones. These are tiny. This is only about the size of my pinky, the last digit of my pinky, and there are about 6 eggs in each one of these. So 6 little baby bees being raised up in there. And so bee boxes typically have those holes. You want a good bee box has, or a bee house has holes of varying size because they're not all appropriate for, one hole is not appropriate for different size bees. So you need to produce a place for them that has a size that's appropriate for them. So this box right here, this native bee box, these reeds actually were too big, and for 2 years it was left unattended. You can see these holes are pretty big. So for this person, I suggested that they take smaller reeds and stuff them into some of these holes. And after she did that, she got some activity there. So holes can be too big. This is a design that was produced by the Bees Needs for CU. And so you can find this instruction, or I can email it to you. It's online at thebeesneeds.colorado.edu, the bee block recipe. And it tells you exactly how big, how deep to go on those blocks. Great for making your own stuff. I see somebody taking a picture of it, so I'll wait for just a second. Great. All right. And so they can be made into different stuff. You've got a bee box here that's combined on the left with a little birdhouse. So it doesn't have to be just for your bees. You can have other stuff. One of the more important things, though, is location. This poor little box was down in the shade on the ground. And really, your bee boxes, they're going to want to be at chest height, head height, and on the south-facing wall of a fence or house where they're getting some sun. And they can vary in size. You've got some that contain all sorts of stuff trying to attract pollinators, moths, any kind of insect that might want to overwinter or over season in a particular area. And so we've got some here. This is actually full of grass. These are actually wasps, the grass-carrying wasps that are nesting in this block of wood as well. So a few more. Make it, and they will come. So the problem with this block right here was they were all one size. She was only attracting one type of bee in here. So in between all these spots, I recommended that she drill smaller holes of varying sizes to attract more types of pollinators. And then typically the honeybees, the only one that you're going to find in a large box like the Langstroth, the Warre hives, that type of stuff. So honeybees only. So some other things that we can do to help bees. Native bees love native plants. I mentioned that. Here's the native bee website. I'm sorry, the Native Plant Society's website. And then planting trees and shrubs and leaving old wood on property. And trees are particularly of interest. Trees actually can, if you spread them out, they can cover an entire football field. So you can get a floral resource that is absolutely huge. So a lot of our trees can be estimated to have up to or more 23 billion grains of pollen in a single tree. That is quite a bit of pollen for a resource. And then something else that we don't have time to talk about, but honeydew from aphids and scales actually are a resource for bees when flora resources are limited. So when aphids are, within tolerable means and not absolutely going rampant, they are welcome because they produce a resource that all insects can utilize. So to finish off, I'd just like to finish up with this quote: "If we want children to flourish, to become truly empowered, then let us allow them to love the earth before we ask them to save it," by David Sobel. And some books. These are some of my favorites. The Bees in Your Backyard, Bee and Natural History. There's quite a few that are out there. Bumblebees of North America is an excellent one for identifying your bumblebees. Here's a picture of the cover. So there's two of my favorites, Bees in Your Backyard and Bumblebees in North America. If you want to get two books, these are it. There are some other resources. This is a government resource right here. Native bee poster just sort of identifies a few of our species in North America. And again, thank you. Here's some of our information. Please feel free to follow us on Instagram or Facebook. And with that, here's absolutely my favorite organization, PPAN. If you haven't yet, I highly encourage you to make a donation to their organization and thank them for sponsoring and having us. Thank you very much.